The Wars of the Roses was a conflict between two branches of the royal family. So Lancastrian branch, which is represented by the Red Rose, and the Yorkist branch, which is represented by the White Rose. It's also one of the most difficult periods of English history in that you've got this event which lasts from the 1450s through to the 1480s. Numerous people changed sides, some people even changed the names that historians call them, and there are a number of battles, so it's actually quite complex. Having said that, the impact that the Wars of the Roses had on ordinary people was probably quite slight, certainly by comparison with continental Europe. The Wars of the Roses was quite small scale. The role of the 100 Years' War in starting the Wars of the Roses, historians are very split on this question. Obviously, you know, the 100 Years' War ends in 1453. The Wars of the Roses begin, let's say, in 1455 with the first Battle of St Albans. So there's only, 2 years between the two events. It's hard to kind of pin down an actual series of events which link the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses. However, that hasn't stopped historians from trying to do so. At that time, the mid-15th century, England was suffering from an economic downturn. It's against that background that the Wars of the Roses and the 100 Years' War should be seen. I'm inclined to actually say that the causes of the Wars of the Roses are basically about individuals, so that they're about the mistakes made by great men like Richard, Duke of York, Henry VI, Warwick the Kingmaker, and so on, and one woman, Margaret of Anjou. Henry VI was king at the time, so he was king from 1422 until 1461, and then he came back in 1470-71, but that's a part of the complications that we won't go into. I'm inclined to see Henry VI as an absolute disaster, and as the man who basically not only lost England the 100 Years' War, and you could say that that was inevitable. There was no way that England could hold on to half of France. But I think that Henry VI was largely responsible for the Wars of the Roses as well. So this is a doubly incompetent king. The role of Henry VI's mental health in bringing about his ineffectiveness. While I wish to blame Henry VI, in a way he wasn't to blame because of his mental health. From 1453 he had the first mental health breakdown. But the fact is that Henry VI, after that, basically, while he recovers to some extent, basically becomes a cipher. He becomes somebody who's carted around, and it's his wife, Margaret of Anjou, who really tends to dominate the political world from 1453. On the one hand, I think that one can't exactly blame Henry VI for mental health problems. On the other, I still think it's largely Henry VI's undermighty bearing that leads to the Wars of the Roses. Margaret of Anjou's acceptance of political power way to Richard, Duke of York and so on. It's tempting to say that because certainly from 1453 Margaret of Anjou takes more of a role in politics. However, I think that Margaret of Anjou's reputation has been sullied by contemporary chroniclers and also by other historians. Probably after 1453 she was acting on two poles. So she was acting first of all as a French queen that was expected to act in France, in that she was expected to be more political. And secondly, I think after 1453 it's noticeable that she enters English politics largely, I think, to protect the rights of her son, because after 1453 the birth of the son, I think Margaret thinks, well, there's no way that I can rely on Henry VI to protect his rights. Therefore, I've got to do it myself. So I think that Margaret of Anjou has had a bad press from historians. Whether or not her role leads to Richard Duke of York staging the protest, really that goes back to the question of what were Richard Duke of York's motivations and the dynastic motivation. While it's only at the end of his life that Richard Duke of York really makes his dynastic claim public. With the subject of the Wars of the Roses, it's possible to attribute the outbreak of the wars to the rivalry between Richard Duke of York and Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. This is the kind of great men theory of history, that the Wars of the Roses can be attributed largely to the mistakes made by a few great men. The question of the extent to which York enjoyed the wider support of the aristocracy is a moot one. From that, I think one can argue that the economics of the situation didn't really play a major role in it. Telling the story of the Wars of the Roses is rather difficult because of the inadequate sources. These are largely chronicle sources and are largely concerned with the actions of the great men. Most of the chroniclers in the 15th century are pro the Duke of York and the Earl of March, or Edward IV. The chronicles written in the 1500s are largely Lancastrian, because Henry VII came to the throne in 1485, was basically the Lancastrian candidate. So you don't want to go against, these. However, of course, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, so he brought, in effect, the two houses together again. So the chroniclers of his reign and of his son's reign, Henry VIII, are a little bit less partial.